detail of the session this evening, allow me to first introduce myself and our hosts, thereafter complete a bit of housekeeping. My name is Owake Mwate. I serve as the General Manager of the Intellectus Campus Group. We're a training entity that's based in 5 countries with the pleasure of 8 campuses across Botswana, South Africa, Namibia, Swatini, Zimbabwe, and soon to be in Zambia. Intellectus Campus will be your host for this evening's session. We will manage and work the comments and queries for the session. For a bit of housekeeping, colleagues, please note in the chat there is a link for the attendance. Please complete your details per that link. That will enable us to circulate your certificate for you having attended this session. Any attendance details that are on the chat itself may be overlooked or missed by the team, so please ensure that you complete the details per the link. These sessions are intended to be interactive, so please, by all means, make your comments or type out your comments or queries on the chat. You should be recognized and acknowledged after having placed your comments and queries on your chat. Alternatively, please raise your hands to be recognized. Thereafter, you'll be given an opportunity to make your comment or query. Just as a matter of ease of running the session, please can we request that all colleagues other than keynote speakers and moderators, please remain muted. With that said, that concludes our housekeeping requirements. Again, looking forward to this session this evening. If I may allow Dr. Jacqueline Stone to introduce Prof Colleen. Good evening, Dr. Jackie. Good evening, Prof.
Good evening, Obi. Can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Great. I'm not going to start my video because my computer's telling me that my bandwidth may not cope with it. So Prof Colleen Aldous is a recognized leader in healthcare research and a strong advocate for evidence-based medicine. Starting her career with a focus on genetics, she has since led various clinical research initiatives and has a broad overview that spans multiple clinical disciplines. She champions an interdisciplinary approach to clinical research. Prof Aldous is committed to maintaining high ethical standards and rigorous methodologies as a researcher. We had the privilege of hosting her at Victoria Falls, where she gave a lecture similar to this, which was absolutely outstanding. With a publication record that includes more than 170 articles in index journals, numerous book chapters, and a textbook aimed at postgraduate students, Prof Aldous's contributions to the field are substantial. She has been acknowledged for her work, receiving the UKZN Top 30 Award twice and being elected as a member of the Academy of Sciences of South Africa in 2021. She emphasizes the nuances of evidence-based medicine and its effective communication to the public. Her engagement with the community has been particularly impactful, especially during the pandemic, where she has worked on enhancing public understanding of science through the lens of evidence-based medicine. So she has also become a friend and a colleague and has helped me enormously because she writes a lot better than I do. So with that, Colleen, I'd like to introduce you, congratulate you on everything you've achieved so far, and the floor I shall hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Jackie, for that introduction. I'd first like to thank Intellectus Campus as well for giving me this platform to share my thoughts. I think it's very important that we put humanity back into medicine and make medical research a humanitarian endeavor again. I've recorded my presentation because I've got so much to say and I'm so scared that I'm going to miss out little details. So I recorded it this morning and I'm going to share that. But I will be here to answer questions at the end. May I ask the question, can everybody see the presentation?
We can.
Okay, thank you. In the context of healthcare science, I find it increasingly important to clarify misconceptions surrounding evidence-based medicine, or EBM as I'm going to refer to it.
Sorry, Prof, could you restart the presentation,
Throughout
please?
my career, okay, I can. I have focused on. Can I restart it now?
Yes, please.
Okay. Thank you. In the context of healthcare science, I find it increasingly important to clarify misconceptions surrounding evidence-based medicine, or EBM as I'm going to refer to it in the rest of this talk. Throughout my career, I have focused on observational and interventional research, primarily with postgraduate students. Although I haven't directly conducted a randomized control trial, or an RCT, as I'm going to continue to refer to it as, I have substantial expertise in understanding and improving them through my role on our Biomedical Research Ethics Committee at our university. My students and I have contributed significantly to medical science with over 170 publications and the graduation of more than 40 scholars at the doctorate and master's level in healthcare research. These contributions have sometimes led to changes in medical practice, underlining our commitment to evidence-based medicine. During the COVID pandemic, I've observed a troubling trend. The term insufficient evidence was being used to dismiss the efficacy of repurposed drugs, often because the existing research didn't include a large randomized control trial. This narrow view undermines the original intent of EBM as articulated by David Sackett, who is referred to as the father of evidence-based medicine. I wish to clarify that my team's research, predominantly published in peer-reviewed Q1 and Q2 journals, has consistently maintained high quality. It is an incorrect assumption to deem only RCTs and their syntheses as the only form of quality research. Evidence-based medicine has been around in an undefined and an unacknowledged form for centuries, with medicine being practiced based on experience and shared observations. The discovery of vitamin C's impact on scurvy in sailors was discovered in 1747 by James Lind in an experiment where sailors were provided different diets, and that is recognized as the earliest clinical trial. The first double-blinded controlled trial was conducted in the 1940s, as was the first randomized controlled trial. Interestingly, penicillin was not tested using a large double-blinded randomized controlled trial before it was rolled out. Originally discovered in 1928 by Alexander Fleming, penicillin was used to treat conjunctivitis in 1 adult and 3 babies in 1930. He successfully treated severe conjunctivitis in 1932 in a medical student who was about to participate in an inter-hospital rifle shooting competition when he developed conjunctivitis. A decade later, Fleming first used the purified penicillin to treat streptococcal meningitis in a moribund 52-year-old man with meningitis, who went on to recover. He published that work as a case study in the Lancet in 1943. The early 1940s was wartime in Britain, and the War Cabinet called for a meeting on the mode of action of penicillin on the 28th of September 1942. The Penicillin Committee was created on the 5th of April 1943 to produce penicillin rapidly in large quantities with the collaboration of American companies and to supply the drugs to the Allied armed forces. By D-Day in 1944, enough penicillin had been produced to treat all the wounded of the Allied troops. A single published case study was enough in the emergency of war to roll out use quickly and efficiently. Today, penicillin is still routinely used in humans of all ages and in animals, including, of course, if I dare say it, in horses. Not all novel drug interventions in the 20th century were as extraordinary in improving human quality of life, though. Thalidomide was introduced in 1956 and was indicated for anxiety, trouble sleeping, tension, and morning sickness. It had, however, never been tested on pregnant women. Miscarriages and teratogenic effects became apparent in the late 1950s and the early 1960s. More than 10,000 babies were born with a range of severe deformities, resulting in what became known as the biggest man-made medical disaster ever. Beyond this type of unintended blunder by the pharmaceutical industry, other horrific medical research missteps were intentionally performed. The atrocities of the Second World War crimes against humanity in concentration camps led to the Nuremberg Code after the Nuremberg trials unlocked what had been done with adults and children in the interests of furthering scientific understanding. The Tuskegee experiment was carried out between 1932 and 1972 in Alabama in the United States on a group of African American men with syphilis. The purpose of the study was to observe the effects of the disease when untreated. When the study started, there was no treatment for syphilis, so the study was justified. However, by 1947, penicillin was widely available and had become the standard treatment for syphilis. It was withheld from the study participants, though. More than 100 study participants died as a result. These and more blights on the 20th century clinical research and care record saw recognition that medical research and medical ethics needed some rectification. In the 1960s, a randomized control trial was still a rarity. However, advances in statistical analysis and research design saw the practice pick up. Nevertheless, in practice, clinicians were still trained to solve clinical problems by combining reflection on their practice, understanding of underlying biology, and referring to textbooks or experts. Some people refer to this as the art of medicine. Moreover, most of us here survived our childhoods and our early adulthoods with this practice. In the 1960s, the gap between the bench and the bedside was recognized, particularly by the couple Suzanne and Robert Fletcher. In 1982, they published a textbook that described the scientific basis for clinical care. It's called Clinical Epidemiology, The Essentials. In 2020, it was in its 6th edition. At the same time, Alvin Feinstein, a mathematician who became a doctor, recognized the uncertainty inherent in medical practice at the bedside. He was critical of public health studies and introduced rigor into them. He also played a role in bringing epidemiology and medical research together. The need to apply research in clinical decision-making was highlighted in the 70s and 80s, and to this end, critical appraisal of research for clinical practice gained traction. Now often referred to as one of the fathers of evidence-based medicine, David Sackett began using critical appraisal techniques in his bedside teaching in the 1980s. In 1990, one of his students, Gordon Guyatt, building on Sackett, introduced the term scientific medicine to describe this concept. However, this choice of words was seen as derogatory towards traditional methods of clinical practice, and Guyatt coined the inoffensive term evidence-based medicine. It is seen in print in the 1991 ACP Journal Club editorial for the first time. In 1992, Guyot was part of the Evidence-Based Medicine Working Group, which consisted of several scholars, including David Sackett, who published the first comprehensive description of EBM and how it was incorporated into the curriculum at McMaster's University. EBM was now born as a concept and has influenced medical education and other professional practice globally since then. However, to quote Harvey Reisch from Yale University, the misunderstanding is that EBM in fact did not introduce rigor into medical science. It introduced plausibility as a substitute for science. Very soon, the RCT and its various forms, such as the BRCT, the DBRCT, or the DBN-RCT, would come to be recognized as the gold standard for clinical evidence. Today, many clinical researchers have stopped reading about EBM at this point. They accept only large, double-blinded, randomized controlled trials as evidence, and all other evidence is neglected. Whilst it is appropriate in novel drug development to hold this standard, it is not always suitable for answering every clinical research question posed through a clinical problem, particularly not the repurposing of drugs in a fast-moving pandemic. In 1995, Sackett and some colleagues acknowledged that evidence-based medicine was evolving and adapting, and defined EBM at this point as the conscientious, explicit, and judicious use of current best evidence in making decisions about the care of individual patients. The practice of evidence-based medicine means integrating individual clinical expertise with the best available external clinical evidence from systematic research. This was a move forward from the 1992 definition, as now personal expertise is recognized more fully. The best available external clinical evidence is defined as clinically relevant research, often from the basic sciences of medicine, but especially from patient-centered clinical research. Sackett stressed the point that evidence-based medicine is not cookbook medicine, because it requires a bottom-up approach that integrates the best external evidence with individual clinical expertise and choices from the patients. External clinical evidence can inform but can never replace individual clinical expertise, and it is this expertise that decides whether the external evidence applies to the individual patient at all, and if so, how it should be integrated into a clinical decision. However, many have interpreted EBM as a cookbook approach, negating all research that was not an RCT as irrelevant and discounting clinical expertise and patient choice as irrelevant. They have reduced the complexity of clinical decision-making to a yes or no response to a single study method. In 2003, Smith and Pell made a point regarding the universal acceptance of only the RCT as relevant clinical evidence in their editorial on parachute use to prevent death and major trauma related to gravitational challenge, a systematic review of randomized control trials. They conclude their experiment by stating, "We feel assured that those who advocate evidence-based medicine and criticize the use of interventions that lack an evidence base will not hesitate to demonstrate their commitment by volunteering for a double-blinded, randomized, placebo-controlled crossover study." In the early 2000s, evidence-based medicine began to be presented in this well-known evidence-based medicine pyramid. Evidence-based medicine's EBM's central tenet is to consider all available evidence when making treatment recommendations and decisions. The traditional pyramid does not include all types of research. You can see here there is no laboratory medicine, no mechanism of action medicine research either. So this is where the first misinterpretations and distortions of the understanding of evidence-based medicine has taken place. the certainty of evidence as you move from expert opinion through to case-controlled cohort studies, etc., has been inappropriately replaced by the term quality of evidence, leading to a shift away from considering the totality of evidence to focusing exclusively on randomized controlled trials at higher levels. The replacement of the word certainty with the word quality in the figure has led to the incorrect conclusion that reports in the RCT level and above are acceptable, while all observational studies and background information, expert opinions, etc., which are found only in the lower levels of the pyramid, are improperly dismissed. This also ignores the fact that high-quality case-controlled studies would be found in the lower level of the pyramid model, and poor-quality double-blinded randomized controlled trials will be found higher up. Never in the history of using EBM theory has it been that only a specific type of study design is considered adequate for informing practice. The incorrect but common practice of replacing certainty with quality has shifted focus away from considering the totality of evidence to focusing exclusively on RCTs and their meta-studies for clinical and governmental decision-making. By replacing certainty with quality, medical training and media discourse have ingrained in physicians and the public that a priori case series are of poor quality and RCTs are of high quality. This has been a serious misuse of EBM, especially during the COVID pandemic. For example, RCTs proving a drug does not work and which were not well designed or executed have been accepted as good quality because of their position in the pyramid model, not because of their true scientific quality. Conversely, the well-run case series rendering more reliable results with more certainty than poorly executed RCTs have been ignored. However, applying the principles of EBM correctly by looking at all types of research across several study designs may provide an increased level of certainty that would be missed when applying the quality assumptions of this pyramid model. More importantly, while a single observational study may be of lower certainty than a single RCT, a collection of observational studies often have similar findings to a collection of RCTs. In fact, many studies comparing the results of observational studies and RCTs have shown little or no significant difference between them. Early on, there are only case studies and no RCTs in a medical emergency. It is likely that the results of the more successful early case studies will be more similar to those of the RCTs performed later, and therefore it's important to use the signals from those early studies to guide treatment and further research. The evidence-based pyramid is not a substitute for proper reasoning about study methods and results. RCTs are not automatically superior to other types of studies. Meta-analyses are not necessarily better evidence than the collection of studies than they include. All of these suppositions, which are put forward as undeniable fact, have been emphasized to urge medical researchers into expensive research paradigms that require large grants supplied by industry, creating conflict of interest in many cases. In this presentation, I would like to introduce on behalf of my team the Totality of Evidence-Based Medicine Wheel, or the TEBM wheel, which includes all of the types of reports that are found in the pyramid and also includes other real-world data that is available. By totality, we mean both the totality of the types of reports and the totality of the reports for a given type. The TEBM wheel also shows outcomes and visualizes the relative numbers of reports and outcomes without the biased quality hierarchy as represented in the pyramid model. The wheel does not include information about patient sample size or other attributes, as the model is not intended to compare or evaluate individual reports. Therefore, considering all of the available data, not just RCTs and higher, as in the case of the pyramid model, is visualized in the TEBM wheel. So let us look at the utility of the totality of evidence-based medicine wheel. When selecting medications for repurposing, a retrospective review of existing data for similar diseases would be an appropriate first step in evaluating therapeutic potential in a pandemic. The WHO's Vigi Access database will provide all adverse events data and indicate safety and possible contraindications. This could lead, at worst, to trying a drug protocol that later proved ineffective, that is, a type 1 error. Such an error, however, would not pose a safety risk. Case series and cohort studies could quickly follow. Dosing to effect for such drugs is especially useful and available to the frontline practitioner, but not safe with a new drug. When examining the repurposing of therapeutics, all efficacy evidence should be scrutinized, and the TEBM wheel provides a useful visual summary as a starting point without the bias arising from the inaccurate label quality of evidence that appears in the EBM pyramid. An additional bias is avoided by using the wheel instead of the pyramid because of the more extensive types of evidence that the wheel contains. Note that the wheel includes all types of reports found in the pyramid as well as additional ones. The complete wheel also shows outcomes and presents a visual presentation of the relative numbers of reports and outcomes. In short, the wheel presents a superset of the data in the pyramid while omitting the quality certainty hierarchy associated with the pyramid model. By the end of the 20th century, social sciences had come to a similar conclusion wherein their evaluation methodology had replaced the pyramid model with a circular model whose content is consistent with and somewhat similar to parts of our TEBM wheel. Unlike the circular model, a given wheel only displays a single kind of result, which is efficacy or safety. The additional outer ring shows the number and relative proportions of outcomes for each type of report. The TEBM wheel thereby becomes a possible indicator of clinical equipoise. The color-coded display of outcomes in the outer ring makes the TEBM wheel an application tool, while the pyramid model, at best, a teaching tool for certainty of evidence. The social science methodology holds that a composite of all methods constitute best scientific evidence, not postulating a single best method from a limited evidence review by government agencies or medical boards. The TEBM wheel can lead clinicians and decision makers to a broader body of useful information. It is therefore essential for decision makers to balance RCTs with observational findings. This would facilitate doctors making decisions at the bedside that integrate RCTs and observational studies with their personal observations as they formulate individual treatments and collectively advance a community standard of care. Healthcare practitioners regularly prescribe drugs outside of the scope of their initial approved usage without requiring new approval. It's a practice referred to as off-label use. Before making therapeutic decisions, practitioners should consult existing literature and become aware of the existing evidence base to establish a drug's safety profile and possible efficacy for a disease. Prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, there was existing evidence of the safety of ivermectin. In the first year of the pandemic, searching the WHO's Vigi Access database would have been the first call to check on existing safety data. RCTs and observational studies from the development and extensive use beginning in the 1980s would have shown that ivermectin had an established safety profile for human use. The dosages proposed for the treatment of COVID-19 were adequately covered based on the data from a phase 1 ascending dose study and subsequently published in a peer-reviewed publication in 2002. Even prior to the pandemic, ivermectin was being considered as a therapeutic for treating several viral and other conditions without any proof of mechanism. By May 2020, a few months into the pandemic, a laboratory study from Australia demonstrated that ivermectin inhibited replication of the SARS-CoV-2 virus by preventing it from entering the nucleus. The authors reported that by 48 hours, there was an incredible decrease in viral RNA, indicating that ivermectin treatment resulted in the effective loss of essentially all viral material by 48 hours, and was the most effective of the 2,000 drugs tested. Although this in vitro study used a very high ivermectin dose, it showed that ivermectin killed the virus. A recent review had documented that in addition to the effects of ivermectin on SARS-CoV-2 replication by interaction with host proteins, it can also interfere with entry of the viruses and modulate the inflammatory response. This confirms a previous extensive review that ivermectin has multiple mechanisms of action for different indications, including its anti-inflammatory properties, resulting in the inhibition of several inflammatory mediators that can erupt into the cytokine storm to which so many COVID-19 patients had succumbed prematurely. At about the same time, at a home for the elderly in France, there was a 66-year-old lady resident with profuse scabies. She was treated with ivermectin. Sometime later, some of the other residents also came down with scabies. To control the scabies outbreak, everyone in that particular home, including the staff, were given ivermectin, and at the same time, a COVID-19 outbreak was declared. None of the ivermectin-exposed residents developed severe COVID or died, while residents from other homes for the elderly showed higher COVID-19 rates. Usually, once COVID-19 enters a facility in any healthcare system, its rapid dissemination is associated with a high risk of death. Following news of this event, physicians began using the standard human scabies dosage regimen with some success. Subsequently, several observational and RCTs were run. So there was some evidence happening, but now what do we do with the wheel? We have to start looking for the actual evidence. So we secure the services of an actuary who has no conflict of interest to carry out a literature search for all published reports on the use of ivermectin included in the treatment of COVID-19 since 2020. As proof of concept, we used only reports found in the PubMed database, which is an internationally accepted medical literature resource. We acknowledge that this search would not capture all the available literature. The in-depth literature trawl showed a large amount of evidence for ivermectin from disparate study methods. To get a sense of the scope of this evidence, the TEBM wheel shows all report types, the relative numbers of publications for each type, and the proportion of positive, negative, and inconclusive outcomes. The search parameters did not include information about patient sample size or individual patient attributes. The obtained reports were neither compared nor individually evaluated for quality so that the results would remain unbiased. This would be performed at a later stage when such scientific report, regardless of status, is critically evaluated and overall conclusions made based on the totality of evidence. On the 10th of October 2022, the actuary retrieved 377 articles, and after filtering, we used 265 articles published and publicly available, and these are all peer-reviewed reports on this particular drug-based COVID-19 regimen that was found in PubMed. After excluding reports not meeting inclusion criteria, namely the words COVID-19 or SARS-CoV-2 and ivermectin occurring in the title, we analyzed the balance of these reports for various attributes. The PubMed results were sent to a citation manager and imported into Mendeley. This allowed for each article to be loaded and the abstract reviewed to understand the nature of the study, its findings and conclusions. The data was cleaned by excluding from our analysis the PubMed entries not relevant to the search. Such PubMed entries that we kept fell into 3 categories. That is, positive studies that showed that ivermectin did work, negative studies that showed that ivermectin did not work, and inconclusive studies. When using ivermectin-based regimens to treat COVID-19, about 1/5 of the research papers reported positive outcomes, and another 1/5 reported negative ones. Most papers reported inconclusive results, sometimes because no major or systemic benefits from the treatment were observed, and other times because sample sizes were too small to provide statistical significance for their positive findings. Still, no significant or permanent adverse events were reported in any of the studies. About 2/3 of the papers are reviews and mechanisms of action studies. About 1 paper in 8 is a structured analysis. The remaining 1/5 of the papers are clinical studies, which included randomized controlled study trials, cohort studies, case control studies, case reports, case series, and population studies. They are the primary focus of this report. There were 61 clinical studies categorized by whether the research suggested a beneficial effect from ivermectin-based treatments for COVID-19 patients. All the outcomes displayed in the outer ring of the ivermectin TEBM wheel were determined by the statements about efficacy in the conclusion sections of the reports, even in those few cases where the conclusions were contradictory or not supported by the findings. Many of the clinical reports used to construct the ivermectin TEBM wheel for COVID-19 are statistically inconclusive, while still showing signals of clinical benefit with acceptable safety. This in turn suggests further research for confirmation and potential protocols for the frontline practitioner. What needs to be done is to look at the positive results providing a proof of concept for using ivermectin regimens, and both the positive and inconclusive results with positive signals for designing protocols. As multi-drug protocols are developed, these positive effects are leveraged with additional drugs to impact additional dimensions of the syndrome. Negative results are also useful in that they suggest the use of new treatment strategies, though not necessarily drugs to avoid. In all cases, known safety profiles should limit what is initially tried. Looking at the wheel for ivermectin, what is clear is that there are signals from all types of reports for the efficacy of ivermectin when treating COVID-19. It is important to bear in mind that while the wheel for ivermectin does include numbers for outcomes, those numbers are not to be used in a comparative way, but only as indicators of outcomes, especially because individual reports have not been evaluated for quality, and the conclusions in some reports actually differ from their findings. The wheel presents the totality of the evidence, encouraging users to integrate the results from multiple sections. As an example, the mechanistic studies should help explain and predict the results of the clinical trials. The wheel is not about weighting the relative merits of the individual sections or reports. On closer inspection of just the 27 RCTs included in the wheel, we observed that the protocols having more successful outcomes used higher dosages, more elaborate combinations of other drugs and adjuncts, and longer regimens than those with less successful outcomes. Additionally, those more successful protocols often had ivermectin taken with fatty meals. Regardless of outcomes, the findings of every one of the reports confirmed the absence of serious adverse events consistent with previous studies using ivermectin for other diseases. When looking at the ivermectin TEBM wheel for treating COVID-19, researchers and decision makers should be alert to the considerable number of positive outcomes visible throughout its entirety. They should guide their research and pronouncements accordingly. In a pandemic situation, we should rely upon frontline healthcare practitioners for their training and experiences. It is they who are, after all, at the face-to-face with patients and must make treatment decisions. Once assured that the treatment is safe and likely effective, consenting patients may be treated and should be followed up closely. The main objective is to cause no harm to the patient while anticipating positive outcomes and recording any negative ones. Healthcare practitioners should monitor patients closely, modifying treatments accordingly, and publicly sharing their results through the publication of case studies and case series, which in turn should lead to higher certainty studies. Governmental and medical authorities monitoring such results should recommend, as appropriate, experimental use on a broader scale while knowing that the drug might not work, but at least it should be safe. At an institutional level, the TEBM wheel for efficacy should be drawn up early in a pandemic using all then existing data. The wheel organizes the data visually and can show the existence of reports with positive, negative, and inconclusive efficacy outcomes. Analyzing those reports may yield information about the other important aspects of therapeutic decision-making, including dosage, safety, and mechanism of action. The totality of evidence, by its very nature, will result in some of the evidence appearing in multiple sections of the wheel, namely in both primary and secondary reports, though the secondary reports often have greater influence on the direction of further research and treatment. The wheel should be updated in real time as further evidence comes available. This will provide comprehensive summaries of the totality of evidence developing around the efficacy of drug treatment protocols. Concurrently, phase 1 ascending dose studies should be initiated, followed by phase 2 to 3 pivotal studies in the clinical setting. Early on in the pandemic situation, double-blinded RCTs on already approved therapeutics are neither cost-effective nor required, since the safety profile and some mechanisms of action may already be known. Therefore, as a first response, health providers should be encouraged to prescribe such medications off-label. As case studies and observational studies become available, they will provide early signals of efficacy and should not be ignored, but should be used to design clinical protocols for RCTs. It is important to note that the permutation of protocols using well-known therapeutics is larger than that for only RCTs. This permutation of protocols gives frontline practitioners greater flexibility to assess and customize treatment regimens as they search for increasingly positive results. Such flexibility is not available in RCTs, especially when dosing to effect. To prevent known therapeutics from being overlooked in future pandemics, our new approach of considering the totality of evidence should be initiated early on. Evidence-based medicine's original spirit for safe and effective treatment for all is acknowledging the best available evidence, which is not exclusive to, but inclusive of RCTs. All primary clinical studies should be recognized, including those from observational and laboratory studies. Randomized controlled trials will require time and funding, both resources often in short supply. Observational studies, together with prior safety studies for known drugs, can provide rigorous and reliable evidence in a much faster time. There could be sufficient scientific evidence to allow for testing the scaling up of the dosage within the known safety profile. The only downside would be a lack of efficacy. Using EBM in its narrow form as opposed to the totality of evidence raises the ethical question. Is it fair to the patient to only look at the evidence from a restricted set of methods? In medical ethics, clinical equipoise occurs if there is genuine uncertainty within the expert medical community about the preferred treatment. The TEBM wheel can display possible clinical equipoise. When it does, there should be different responses depending upon the type of responder. Medical practitioners should be guided by the positive signals for treatment and by the negative signals for what to avoid. Clinical researchers should perform further studies to improve efficacy or help select among regimens. Governmental and medical authorities should initially present the different findings, while remaining neutral concerning any pronouncements on treatments, and then modify their neutrality accordingly as new reports are published. The basis for those pronouncements should include reports on clinical therapeutic outcomes as found in observational studies, including retrospective chart reviews and laboratory studies that provide efficacy explanations that are useful in understanding those outcomes. The collective outcomes of anecdotal evidence, along with other observational studies, have strong plausibility. They should not be rejected as coincidental, as is commonly done today. In the case of repurposed drugs with known safety profiles, the amount and value of the information gleaned from their wheels will indicate whether RCTs are required to determine efficacy. Many published studies in the ivermectin TBM wheel were retrospective reports where ivermectin was included as a therapeutic option consistent with the ethical therapeutic obligation of the treating physicians. In a pandemic with a definite mortality rate and a wheel that indicates possible clinical equipoise, one could argue that carrying out an RCT with a placebo control arm would be unethical. In fact, the only studies truly required initially during the COVID-19 pandemic would have been dosing to effect with repurposed drugs and their adjuncts, as suggested by the reports with positive outcomes or signals in the TEBM wheel. Replacing the hierarchical pyramid model with our non-hierarchical TEBM wheel is consistent with the social science evaluation of methodology, which replaced the pyramid model with a circular model having the same form but only somewhat similar content to our wheel and lacking the display of outcomes that enables the conclusion of possible clinical equipoise. That social science methodology has reached the consensus that only a multiplicity of methods which are used in a complementary fashion will eventually give a realistic estimate of the effectiveness and safety of an intervention. Every research method has strengths and weaknesses which cannot be resolved within the method itself. Therefore, triangulating a result achieved with one method by replicating it in other methods may provide a more powerful and comprehensive approach to TEBM, to evidence-based medicine, when compared to the prevailing RCT approach. Rather than postulating a single best method, this view acknowledges that there are optimal methods for answering specific questions and that a composite of all methods constitutes best scientific evidence. The TEBM wheel model proposed in this presentation provides an easily understood graphic that provides information about the types and amount of research papers published. Most notably, it gives research results as a body of work. In the case of efficacy, it shows positive, inconclusive, and negative outcomes, which should alert medical decision makers to treatment signals and references suggesting further research. By populating the wheel using objective criteria that include the totality of evidence-based medicine, the contents of the wheel should be less subjective. It will draw the user's attention to observational studies, mechanisms of action and non-systematic reviews, and the RCTs and structured analysis used almost exclusively now. The objectivity of the wheel is built into the selection process, which limits its content to peer-reviewed published literature, filtered by objective keywords and phrases, such as the name of the disease and one or more of its treatments, but not the results of those treatments. However, it is crucial to keep in mind that the objectivity of the selection process does not reduce the subjectivity of the individual reports themselves. During the pandemic and before successful protocols have been developed and agreed upon, frontline practitioners need wide latitude to experiment with drugs and treatments known to be safe. This is the medical equivalent of generating many hypotheses by brainstorming that leads to successful decision-making, which will cull out the ineffective and select the effective. And an advantage of using repurposed drugs is their known safety record. When we used the literature for treating COVID-19 with ivermectin as an example, its wheel showed both positive and negative outcomes across the display of all types of results. Thus, our wheel encourages consideration of the totality of evidence in a non-hierarchical manner. In contradistinction, the quality of evidence pyramid omits the mechanisms of actions and non-systematic reviews found in the wheel. This pyramid also incorrectly claims that the higher the pyramid's level, the higher the report's quality. In actuality, the pyramid assigns higher certainty, not higher quality, and even then, as the number of reports increases, the distinction in certainty between levels tends to disappear. As doctors make decisions at the bedside and in the clinic, the TEBM wheel can lead them to a wider variety of sources of useful information, which ideally they can integrate into their personal observations as they formulate individual treatments and collectively advance a community standard of care, not driven solely by a limited evidence review, government agencies, or medical boards. By not limiting consideration to the upper levels of the pyramid, the wheel is a more useful and informative graphic. More importantly, our wheel provides a graphic alternative to the improperly labeled quality of evidence pyramid, now taught in medical schools and included in textbooks, where RCTs and higher are presented as the gold standard and as the only acceptable form of evidence. Had totality evidence-based medicine wheels for all repurposed drugs been drawn up by mid-2020, the ivermectin wheel would have provided useful information for designing further studies. Through to the end of 2020, information on regimens specific to COVID-19 might have been forthcoming. RCTs designed since 2021 would have had reliable information on dosage frequency, dosage regimens, efficacy, safety, and mechanism of action to inform their protocols. One limitation of what we have presented so far is that we only used PubMed to provide a proof of concept. Applying the TEBM wheel in a real-world situation should take on a broader trawl of reliable publications. One can start with PubMed and expand from there. Many thanks, and I'm happy to take on any.
Thank you very much, Colleen. That was, as always, a brilliant presentation. I'm going to share my screen, except that let me just see if this is working. Can you give me the ability to share screen, whoever's hosting?
I don't know if
Dr.
I
Jane, you
can.
can share screen.
Oh, okay, there you go.
You can share screen, your co-host.
Okay. Can you see the slide?
Yes.
I'm going, just to keep Belle happy, I am going to go into slideshow so you can see the whole screen. And one of the things that I feel very strongly about is that we need African solutions for African problems. I think that if you look at the African data over the pandemic, it's very, very clear that whatever we did worked a lot better than what was done possibly in the places that insist on double-blind randomized controlled trials. One of the other interesting things is that Zimbabwe had 1/5 of the mortality rate of South Africa with the same demographic. And one of the factors is the wide availability of ivermectin in Zimbabwe, whereas SAPRA completely restricted it. So what should have been the real questions in 2020? It should have been, does early treatment with combination therapy work better than doing nothing? Does ivermectin, doxy, zinc, vitamin B3 and C work better than doing nothing? And by December 2020, with Dr. Peter McCulloch coming in, does early sequenced multi-drug combination therapy work better than doing nothing? And the answer was quite clear. And Colleen and I have both worked with Dr. Eleftherios, and he is a professor of mathematics, and he showed unequivocally that both the Zelensky protocol, the protocols we were using here in Africa, Professor Barodi's protocols, and Peter McCulloch's protocols were better than doing nothing. The absence of evidence of effect is not the same as evidence of absence of effect, because no one has been able to prove that ivermectin does not work, particularly when adequate doses are used for long enough. So this is a single case study. This patient presented with with classical COVID symptoms and ground glass appearance on the CT. The two pictures on the left are on Tuesday, the 31st of March. By Friday, he had a 75% improvement in his CT chest after combination therapy. Now, what is important about this is that our expectation from other studies is that within 3 days, we would have been expecting a whiteout. He was a high-risk patient with comorbidities and cardiac problems. 4 patients, is it anecdotal? All of these 4 patients presented with saturations of under 80%. Within 24 hours on combination therapy, these patients were all saturating over 85%, which means that they did not need the precious oxygen that we did not have. And we've got 3 different observational studies, one from Nigeria, which is the blue line, where they used ivermectin, vitamin C, and zinc. And then both in Malibu, Sabine Hassan has sent her apologies. She is in the middle of her day in Malibu, so she can't join the call, which is a pity because, as we all know, Sabine can be quite vocal. And Sabine's green line and my red line, and Professor Aldous and the team that produced this graph can take credit for producing the graph. I only provided the data. And what we see is this rapid, within 24 hours, improvement in oxygen concentration. And if we compare it to what were the recommendations, which include remdesivir, monoclonal antibodies, enoxaparin, vitamin C, and zinc, we can see very, very clearly that patients actually got worse before they got better, and they never improved up to normal saturation levels. So these kind of observational studies would have made a huge difference at the beginning. And I just want to end with the African solutions for African problems. I think that many of us have been trained in the so-called first world, but we have massive experience with infectious disease in sub-Saharan Africa and in Africa in general. And I really do think that it's time that we stopped seeing ourselves as poor countries and realized that the rest of the world need us a lot more than we need their evidence-based medicine protocols, which rely solely on double-blind randomized controlled trials. In 2020, we put forward a protocol for a double-blind randomized controlled trial. And A, it was rejected by the ethics committee, but B, the cost was estimated and we didn't have a funder. So I think we also need to acknowledge that in under-resourced settings, we are not in a position to be able to compete with people who manufacture new drugs like remdesivir and like monoclonal antibodies. And in Africa, we need affordable, available, effective medications, and medications that are already proven to be safe for over 4 decades. I'm going to end it there and open it to the floor.
If I may just have a minute to officially thank my team that helped me think out the evidence-based wheel. There's Barry Dansis, who did a lot of the graphics work for me, and his brother, Jerry Dansis, who is a professor of mathematics at Maryland University and very precise in his thinking, and Phil Oldfield from Canada, who helped a lot with the pharmaceutical background. And then, of course, I would like to thank Sean Flanagan for supporting the study by paying the actuary that we employed. We wanted somebody that was completely not involved in medicine at all, who would have no preconceived ideas, who would just be look at the data for the value in the data. And so I think we've got a really good set of data from her. So I'd like to just mention that I extend my gratitude to them.
Great, thanks, Colleen. There is a question, can we acknowledge the role played by COVID, organic and others natural remedies? Do we need to do more on our natural remedies to come up with evidence, especially of the effectiveness? I think that's a very, very important question. We know that in Zimbabwe, we use Zimbani extensively, and there is no question that it was effective. But what we need is funding to do these trials. And we are looking, there are people now who are becoming interested in both the African traditional medicines and the Ayurvedic remedies and the Chinese remedies. What is interesting about Zimbani is it has very high levels of zinc, and we know that zinc ionophores, or zinc and its ionophores, will stop the replication of RNA viruses. So it will stop all RNA viruses, and virtually every respiratory virus is an RNA virus. So one of the things a lot of Zimbabweans do now is as soon as they get flu symptoms, they will use the combination therapy protocols, and within 24 hours, they're better. And that's exceptionally important with the economic position that we're in, because lockdown added 3 million to our extreme poor. And we can't afford to go back there. Also, a lot of people cannot afford to not go to work because they're casually employed, they're not officially employed, and businesses cannot cope with high levels of staff absenteeism. So I think we must acknowledge the natural remedies. Garlic, turmeric, which otherwise is known as curcumin, all the Ayurvedic medicines, Zimbani. The problem is it comes down to funding. And to run a double-blind placebo-controlled study, if you've got 25 million rand in your back pocket, well, I certainly don't, and neither do most of our traditional healers. And I think we really should acknowledge the role of the traditional healers in this pandemic, because I think that they did an enormous amount of good with what they had.
I agree. Jackie, I'd like to say that your statement that we've got to find African solutions for African problems, I think we should go further. We should develop our own self-confidence in thinking for ourselves. So often we've abdicated our thinking to other people we think are cleverer than us, and actually they're not. We've got the brains ourselves. We know our context. We can actually sort ourselves out. We don't need these great Western philanthropic investors to come in and tell us what to do. We should actually start doing these things ourselves. And we can do some of these trials by ourselves. We should start doing case studies. We should start publishing case series. We should work together to do this. We should do some cohort studies. We can then build up. We don't need to pay these 25 million to these people who want to make money out of clinical trials, and there are far too many of them. I have not ever had a grant from anybody for research. All our research has been done on data that we can go and collect ourselves after ethics approval. And I think that's what we must start thinking about that. We've got our problems, let's sort them out. And if we have to start at ground zero with a case study, let's do that.
I couldn't agree with you more, Colleen. And I also think that there's one thing about Africans, and that is we can make a plan.
Yeah.
And there's plan A, B, C, D, and E, because something is bound to go wrong with plan A. So I think that we think out the box a lot more. I think that we underestimate how good we are practically, because although the lack of litigation is also an issue in Africa, it also means, you know, I once, when I was working in Australia, I got a doctor who had been through full training plus 3 years of postgraduate training in family medicine, and she was too afraid to be on call by herself. She could not put up a drip. She was basically completely and utterly useless in terms of her skills. And the reason is that the Australian litigation system was such that her fear was not of making the decision or having the knowledge. Her fear was of litigation. So in Africa, I think that we've had to think on our feet and make a plan with very limited resources so often that we underestimate how good we are.
I agree. We just have to be courageous and just do it.
Dr. Marie Olivier has made a comment that this big pharma will pay for studies not be done on African solutions.
Yeah, they'll buy out the companies that come up with the therapeutics.
Yeah. So, and that is not a joke, actually. We have certainly had a situation occur where one of our doctors in Namibia, who has an absolutely brilliant mitochondrial protocol, has been offered a large amount of money for his protocol to be commercialized, but he has since discovered that in actual fact they want it suppressed because it works so well. So I do think that we need to be aware that our intellectual property should not be shared with those who would ensure that it never sees the light of day.
Yeah, yeah.
So on that note, we are now running 10 minutes over time, and we do have Namibian hosts who operate on German time. So if there are no more comments, I think we should be ending this now. I think we should leave another 5 minutes for people to register, Belle, and then we should close the session unless anybody has anything else burning to say.
Oh, good presentation, mate. It was very, very, very.
Oh, we've lost you.
Thank you, Prof Colleen Aldous, for your good presentations. You give us more input about this. Thank you very much.
It's been an absolute pleasure. And please, if anybody wants to take any discussion further, Jackie's got my contact details. You can email me at any time.
So we've also got another comment from Dr. Charnay. We treated our COVID patients effectively with mostly 100% recovery. We don't need big pharma. Well done, courageous warriors for the truth. So, Colleen, you're definitely one of those, and we do know that those of us that have stood up, but has not been entirely without cost. So well done to everybody who has been involved in ethical patient care, focusing on patient outcomes. So on that note, Obi, can I ask you to close the session?
Dr. Jackie, thank you very much. Prof Colleen, thank you very much. Just looking at the comments, I think many of the comments just take the words away from me, and extending gratitude for both having led this session and Dr. J for having moderated quite well. But thank you very much for leading this session. Prof as well, for your acknowledgement of the extended contributors to this session. Extended gratitude to you and the balance of the team. Colleagues, these sessions would not be run efficiently and run at all without your having been a party to the audience. So extended gratitude to yourselves as well for having made the time to enjoy the delivery of this evening's session. Colleagues, as Dr. Jackie had indicated, we will leave the session open for another 5 minutes, in fact, another 6 minutes to 10 to 8, that's 19:50. So we'll leave it open for another 6 minutes to allow colleagues to complete their attendance. And this is to enable us to circulate your certificates. With that said, colleagues, please feel free to exit the session once you've completed your attendance details. A very good evening to you. Looking forward to you being in the audience again next week, Wednesday, same time. Good evening.
Thank you, Obi. Everybody have a great night.